I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to this week's episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week, we're going to be looking at the 1966 class of movies, a very strange year for the Oscars, less interesting than the 67 year, but very much a 60s Oscar year in a lot of different ways. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I look at a film that was nominated for Best Picture that I believe is forgotten, one that has sort of been lost to time that people haven't really recommended, at least to me. I talk about the Oscar history of the year, the 5 sort of nominees, and where everything was placed and why that history is so crucial at the time. And then I'll talk my thoughts about the film, and then why I think, sort of trying to answer that central question as to why it's been forgotten, why this is a movie that people don't really talk about as much. But jumping into Oscar history, of the 5 nominees, A Man for All Seasons was the eventual Best Picture winner. This was one that sort of had the far and away best chance to win. It won the DGA, it won the BAFTA, it won the Golden Globe for Best Drama. It sort of had a lot of steam behind it and sort of seemed like the all-out favorite. So come Oscar night, it was very obvious that or at least very likely, that A Man for All Seasons has won. This is actually one movie that I think has maybe been close to a forgotten Best Picture winner. I haven't seen it just because, at least in my experience, they showed it multiple times throughout my schooling history. I also think for Orson Welles fanatics, it could be an interesting sort of late performance of his that you appreciated. So I think this is sort of a history class, religion class music, at least movie, at least for me. That's why I almost didn't put it. But in terms of Best Picture winners, this is one that's definitely not, I think, as well acclaimed, despite it being quite a good movie. But that was a far away winner, and it was a clear Best Picture winner. And really the race was, what are going to be the other 4 nominees. Another one was sort of kind of a shoo-in, was the long second, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, who actually ended up winning 1 less Oscars than A Man for All Seasons 5 compared to A Man for All Seasons 6. That's because you had sort of black and white art direction, black and white cinematography, and it picked up a couple more awards, I think, because of that. This is sort of an acclaimed film based on the play. Of course, Mike Nichols, great director, really great movie. So Liz Taylor and Richard Burton, I believe. And Liz Taylor is very fantastic, and she's, so over the top, and it's really just about a dinner party that goes kind of haywire. They talk about relationships and societal things, and it's quite interesting and very play-like, but the dialogue is so sharp and interesting. That's a lot of fun. Alfie is another film, and actually with Alfie and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, we start to see sort of a little bit of a creep of the Hays Code going away, which we'll talk about sort of more in depth maybe in later episodes as it becomes more prevalent. But the Hays Code, also known as the Motion Picture Code, was a sort of self-censorship regulation rule book that Hollywood films would go by. You can't show this, you can't show certain things like interracial kissing, you can't show implied sex scenes or things like that, because they wanted to make it sort of safe without sort of the government's involvement and everything. But this is when we really started to see that code going away, because both these films technically passed the code, despite Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf being sort of violent and incredibly dirty, I guess, words, but then Alfie was very much sexual in that sense, because it's about a man who is sort of a gentleman, I guess, but who used to sleep with lots of women, and that's a film that, actually been remade in 2004 with Jude Law, so this is a film that has its resonance. You can definitely see, a great young Michael Caine performance. You would see him definitely as a James Bond. I'd like to see that alternate history, but this is kind of his James Bond in a lot of ways. Then another nomination that I probably could have did was The Sand Pebbles. This is a Robert Wise film. Robert Wise just coming off of The Sound of Music in '65, which we'll be talking about next episode, because we work backwards. And then he also did West Side Story. So he's sort of hot right now. But this film is sort of a typical kind of war epic, unmemorable Steve McQueen performance. Not one that's sort of been highly recommended. And it really was my option between The Sand Pebbles, but I really wanted to do The Russians Were Coming, because this is a film that I think has been kind of lost to time. Maybe it's some people's favorite sort of comedies that people will see. I know a lot of people will watch it just because it's a Best Picture nominee, but kind of interesting director that we've been dodging for a while, and allowed me to do a Norman Jewison profile. So if you don't know who Norman Jewison is, he's a Canadian filmmaker who doesn't really make Canadian films, makes sort of Hollywood films, but being Canadian, you know, I felt I had to sort of represent him, and we've talked about him. We could have talked to him many times. You know, he's been nominated 7 times with no wins. He had a Best Picture nominee in three decades with Moonstruck in 7 or 88, and then Fiddler on the Roof in 72, and then He and Night, the Best Picture winner we talked about last week in 67. He's a guy that really has just an incredible career. You know, we could have talked about him also Moonstruck, A Soldier Story, Fiddler on the Roof, and then He and the Night. So 4 times. Really, I could have talked about maybe A Soldier Story, but I wanted to go back to his first episodes so we can talk about them sort of all as a whole. And he's kind of a journeyman director, a guy who tackles a bunch of different genres. He does heist movies, musicals, political movies. But I think a large of it has to do with, large of his movies have to do with political injustice or societal, you know, people going against the societal structure at the time or making fun of it. You know, this one has obviously a political edge, similar to In the Heat of the Night at the time. And you know, look at something like In the Heat of the Night in 67, and then 30 years later in 99 with The Hurricane with Denzel Washington, same sort of, you know, African American man going against sort of societal structures and being, you know, racially prejudiced against at their time. So he's very much interested in that, and this sort of being his first Oscar movie, his while not being his breakout, had a lot of summation of a lot of his interests, and won Best Golden Globe for comedy, so it's probably going to get in. But what's very interesting is that only 2 of the Best Picture nominees got in for the 5 directors, including Norman Jewison. He did not get in. Only Mike Nichols and Fred Zinnemann, who's a favorite, Virginia Woolf, and A Man for All Seasons. Okay, so transitioning into my thoughts. This is a film that it has some certain aspects to it that I enjoyed, but overall maybe wasn't a high recommend for me. Like I've said many times in a lot of my episodes, comedy for me, especially older comedies, are very much hit or miss. For some reason or another, some comedies are maybe a little bit more timeless. Something like Airplane or The Jerk has so many jokes per minute that you're bound to find something that you like. But sometimes, I think like this one, feel more relevant to the time, and because I'm removed from the time, it felt a little bit dated, or I just feel like I didn't get the references. And this being a satire, I started to question myself, you know, how really overt should a satire be? You know, I think there's a merit into making movies that for the time that maybe aren't supposed to necessarily hold up. That's not their goal. They're supposed to entertain the people, the most amount of people that are going to see it at the time, and really capture a moment, which at the time, the sort of Russian Red Scare in America was very much a prevalent kind of fear. And Norman Jewison, being Canadian, is able to sort of look with sort of an outsider's perspective on that and sort of make fun of that and critique that. But this is also an interesting film because the satire elements, you know, maybe they were there, maybe I just didn't get it. So is that my fault? I'm starting to question myself because, you know, some of these great satires that are, you know, very much more obvious, I would say Network, Dr. Strangelove. Then you have sort of parody films, right? You have Blazing Saddles, you have some of the Christopher Guest movies, Best in Show, this is Spinal Tap, where you very much know that's in your face that this is a parody, this is or, you know, a satire. I would sort of, I guess, distinguish the two as, you know, satire being usually, I guess, political in nature, but very much it's more subtle than the parody, which is very much kind of obviously using your pre-existing knowledge of references and things like that to make fun of them, where satire is very much more not necessarily about a certain thing. Like the parody would be a genre of the Western movie, it's a certain thing. Satire would be the general political, you know, nuclear scare or the general political Red Scare kind of thing. But I started to think to myself, you know, if you have a movie like Fight Club, which a lot of people, including myself, kind of very much see the satirical elements of it. I think there are many satirical elements of it. But then I think some people don't get that at all, and they, you know, they sort of get the message that Tyler Durden is saying and really speaks to them. And I think some people actually go the other way too far as well. They think, oh, it's, you know, such a satire that every little thing adds up and Tyler Durden doesn't make any sense and he's so ridiculous. You know, I think, at least from my opinion for that movie, not to go on a tangent, but, you know, obviously I think the appeal of Tyler Durden is prevalent, and I think you understand him, and that's why I sort of sympathize with people who understand his sympathy. But overall, I think it is a satire making fun of sort of these Generation X people who just want conflict or just want some sort of interesting thing to happen within the generation and consumerism, and there's many other things like that. But with the Russians is coming, is David Fincher's fault that, some people misinterpreted Fight Club? Or should he have made it so much more overt that you can't misinterpret it? And really sort of the way I draw the line is, I think you can't control audience interpretation in a lot of ways. I think that's a really difficult thing to do. I also think that sometimes that's an impossible thing to do, so you have to sort of make the movie. I think, really you want to make it sort of subtle in general, but maybe have a couple lines that are kind of obvious, that kind of sort of show your hand a bit, so they can make a little bit more clear to the audience sort of your intentions and what you're trying to get from them and what you're trying to say about the movie, because ultimately a lot of times filmmakers are trying to say something or have a thesis statement within their own movie, even though sometimes they try to be bipartisan, for example. So why has this been forgotten? I think that it belongs to a generation who grew up within this Red Scare and the Russians being kind of the enemy, and I'm looking at it from a unique perspective. I'm looking at it sort of a history timeline. So to me, in '66, they're still sort of in it. It still goes within the '80s and dies down, come the '90s. As I don't know where they sort of do it. I know Ronald Reagan sort of was the one that late in his term, he sort of really ended the Cold War with Sergei Gorbachev. Is that his name, I believe? No, I'm not a history buff. But the point being is that I think this belongs to a generation. So, I think it has merit for the people the majority of people who have seen it and revolve in that time, and it was a good time for them, I'm sure, but maybe it's not supposed to be held up and be scrutinized in this sort of way for someone like me, because I just felt like I was not in on the joke. And there's some things I really enjoyed. I did enjoy the physical comedy a lot, but that's kind of a timeless aspect. But some of the elements that I think they would say something and you clearly almost like they pause for a joke, I was kind of left hanging like, wait, what? I just felt a little bit out of it, and even the ensemble cast aren't sort of these big stars of my time. That some guys who have transitioned, like Alan Arkin and Carl Reiner, of course, but some guys just have not. So I didn't really get that appeal out of it. So it's just a film that feels very much of its time, that maybe you really enjoyed when you were a kid, or when you enjoyed still now when you watched it. But ultimately, I don't think this is maybe. From a 2019 viewpoint, from a 20-year-old's viewpoint, I'm not exactly sure if that's the right. It's necessarily that kind of movie made for me. That's all I'm saying. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Comment below. Let me know some of your favorite films from 1966. Interesting year, so I'd like to see what you guys pick. That's about it. I hope you enjoyed the video. And until next time, stay tuned.